Hey guys, welcome to Boxing Squared for boxing news and views from around the internet. With Joe Joyce's win over Daniel Dubois, the question becomes, what next? And who next? And how far can Joe Joyce go? And the version of Joe Joyce that beat Daniel Dubois, the one that we saw utilizing his height, his reach, utilizing the jab as a weapon, and actually showing some head movement, not blocking punches with his face, that version of Joyce can do something in the heavyweight division, I believe. If you've got a good jab and you've got a good chin, you can go places in the division. So I thought, let's actually do a little exercise, go through some names. So I've got the BoxRec top 20 up here on screen. Why don't we go through this? But there's a couple of names that fall outside that people have been mentioning, and we'll start there first. Carlos Takam, he's called out Joe Joyce saying, hey, I think you need another test. And to me, Carlos Takam, who's about 40 now, he hasn't looked great in the past year or so and has been on the decline. Joe Joyce, the bigger man here, I'd be picking him to win that fight. I think at this point in his career, Carlos Takam doesn't have enough to keep it interesting with Joe Joyce in the sense of making it a close fight. I think that Joe Joyce would probably win, similar to Bryant Jennings actually, a fight, maybe 8 rounds to 4 or something like that. I think Carlos Takam is a bit too past it at this point. No disrespect to him, but I don't think that's the test that he needs at this point. I think the Daniel Dubois win proves that he is ready for something a bit bigger and better. But perhaps because of maybe promotional considerations, and he has been with Frank Warren, and I don't know the sort of status of his deal with Warren, perhaps he will not be able to get the sort of fight that he wants next, and maybe he will be forced to take some sort of interim step like a Takam. But who knows? But another name, Filip Hrgović. He's currently outside the top 20 on BoxRec, ranked at 25. And they did meet in the amateurs. They do have history. And actually, Joyce took some really big punches from Hrgović. But bearing in mind they fought some considerable time ago. But that would be interesting because both Hrgović and Joyce, they both have good chins, both have good jabs, but out of the two, who's the better technician? Well, in the pros, Filip Hrgović has gone away from his amateur style to some extent, although we did see flashes in the Rydell Booker fight. I actually think that this would be a highly competitive matchup. And it could be one of these ones that goes to a decision. So if it comes to a boxing shootout, who would you pick in that one? I think some people would be leaning towards Filip Hrgović. But it would be an interesting fight nonetheless. And it would be part of that next generation, that renewal of fighters who are coming through, who've been among the top prospects for a number of years now. And it would be great to see some of those guys fighting, just as we saw Joyce against Dubois. So getting to the top 20 on BoxRec, and this is just BoxRec. I know not everyone loves the ranking system, but I had to go by something. Martin Bakole. Now this would be an interesting fight, but these two are well known to each other. Bakole and Joyce have done a number of rounds together. But a guy in Joyce with a really good engine, really good heart, would he just be able to wear down Martin Bakole? We have seen Bakole make adjustments since his loss to Michael Hunter in 2018. So I think it would be a different prospect, Martin Bakole, in a bigger fight the second time around. Perhaps some people will argue that he was underdone for that fight with Michael Hunter and underprepared. I don't think that would happen a second time. It'd be a very highly entertaining fight. Bakole is looking for a breakthrough fight. Just not so sure that he'd get it against Joyce, but I like that fight. At number 19, Gerald Washington. I would be confident in picking Joe Joyce against a guy like Washington, and you could argue if he couldn't get the sort of fight that he would want to be in next, either a final eliminator or a potential title shot or something of that ilk, or he couldn't get a name in the top 10, someone like a Washington, who I wouldn't have in my top 20, I think he's more a guy somewhere around top 30 level-ish, I think he would be beaten by Joe Joyce. I think it's one of those cases. We saw Jarrell Miller against Gerald Washington. When the times got tough later in the fight and the pressure and the volume came too much, he crumbled. We have seen that a couple of times from Gerald Washington. I would expect the same if Joe Joyce fought Washington. Number 18 is quite interesting because Adam Kovnatski is a guy that in some respects has been Much maligned like Joe Joyce, Kovnatski is a guy who comes forward, throws a lot of volume, without much regard to his defense, blocking punches with his face. Now this sounds familiar, doesn't it? Joe Joyce has been accused of that numerous times. But Adam Kovnatski and Joe Joyce, I think that would be a very fun fight. But I think the bigger, taller man who's got many of the same attributes, but maybe a better chin, it'd be interesting to see that fight. I think Joyce probably could win that one. Robert Helenius. Now this is interesting because we saw what Helenius did against Kovnatski. He was able to land some big power punches. He was able to stop Kovnatski in his tracks. Could he do the same to Joe Joyce, or would Joyce just overwhelm him? It's a question. I like that fight. I think I would pick Joe Joyce to win that one. At number 16, we have Charles Martin. Be an interesting fight. Martin, a southpaw, it's a different look for Joe Joyce. Martin's footwork, sometimes he looks like he's sort of walking in molasses. Martin would not be the bigger man in there. It would be Joe Joyce. Be interesting to see how Martin would cope with that volume and pressure. I think I would favour Joe Joyce in that fight, although I think it would be more competitive than people would probably believe. Number 15. Now, Joe Joyce had called out Luis Ortiz a few years ago, but his trainer at the time, Abel Sanchez, said that Joe Joyce was not ready. Is he ready now? Bearing in mind Ortiz is over 40 now, and if Joe Joyce was utilising his height and his reach as he did against Daniel Dubois, it would probably be a different contest to the one I think many would have envisaged if it was Joe Joyce walking forward, getting picked apart by a good counterpuncher in Ortiz. I'd like that fight. I'd hope they make it. And Joyce, if he does call out Luis Ortiz, I'm sure Luis Ortiz, he will actually answer the call. Number 14, Oscar Rivas. Rivas being a much smaller heavyweight, but he's a very powerful puncher. Relatively good on the technical front. Rivas beat Bryant Jennings, knocked him out in their fight in the final round of it. Rivas is a very good body puncher, and Joyce has shown weakness to the body before. Be a highly competitive fight. Number 13. Now this would be a throwback to the Olympic final. Joe Joyce losing to Tony Yoka. Yoka claiming the gold. Many believing that Joyce perhaps had done enough, but he didn't get the nod. In the pros, many would like to see this one. And given Joe Joyce, his performance and what we've seen him do, and Tony Yoka, he's looked relatively good in his career so far. I would like to see that fight. And I guess the question would be, would Joe Joyce be able to wear down a Tony Yoka? Yoka, if he utilises his height and his reach and his skills, as we have seen him do before, he can be a very tricky customer. There is a bit of a question about his chin, but also after that fight against Christian Hammer, would he be able to stop Joe Joyce? Joyce would just walk forward like a hammer did, close the distance and let some shots away. But if it came down to a shootout, more on the boxing front, a battle of the jabs, and I think a guy like Yoka, with his speed and his technical ability, would fancy that fight. And another interesting fight for Joyce, number 12 there, Joseph Parker. I think this is a case where both guys have very good chins. Joseph Parker is the shorter man with the reach disadvantage. He would have to try overcome those natural disadvantages and win rounds, perhaps trying to close the distance. And Parker's not a great inside fighter, generally likes to fight at mid-range or from the outside. But against a guy like Joyce, if Joyce kept it long, it'd be a very interesting contest, because you could argue that Parker has the better skills, and also he certainly has a speed advantage. Joe Joyce sometimes accused of throwing punches like it's, throws one and it lands 3 days later. So I think that would be a highly competitive fight. I wouldn't expect a knockout in that one, probably going to points. Number 11, Kubrat Pulev. You could certainly make a case that the younger, fresher man, or not too much younger really, bearing in mind Joe Joyce is 35 now, Pulev is on the verge of 40. I think that would be a fight many would favour Joe Joyce in. Number 9 there, Derek Chisora. He is a guy that Joe Joyce has been trying to target in his career. Earlier in it, they did want to make that fight a number of times. Chisora didn't want it. He asked for too much money to take it. I think Joe Joyce would be too much for Derek Chisora. I think he would be able to absorb whatever Chisora was throwing at him. And I do think that Joyce would eventually wear down and wear out a guy like Chisora. And perhaps Chisora, knowing that Joyce is actually probably a trickier customer than some people believe, perhaps that's the reason he hasn't wanted to take the fight. Number 8, Dillian Whyte. I think this would be a highly competitive fight. And I think after the performance against Daniel Dubois, I think many people will be reassessing what Joyce could do in there with White. Michael Hunter at number 7. This is a very tricky style matchup, I think, for Joe Joyce. And I think there are a few guys in here, because of their boxing ability, good footwork and speed, that sort of style is not necessarily going to suit Joe Joyce the best. So guys like Hunter, Alexander Usyk to come, even Joseph Parker to an extent, that matchup's not necessarily great for him. Although if he does catch up with Hunter, or is able to apply pressure, maybe grind him into the dirt, that could be something where Joe Joyce could win through an accumulation. Number 6, Andy Ruiz Jr. I don't think either guy is getting stopped here, but Ruiz Jr., a very good front foot counterpuncher, he would probably fancy, picking Joe Joyce off. We didn't see a lot of counterpunching from Daniel Dubois. Andy Ruiz Jr., we wouldn't have any concerns in that department. It would be a very interesting fight. Could he win it? It's certainly, is that a stretch too far? And the higher you get up the list here, there is questions. Alexander Usyk, they had a very famous fight from the amateurs where Usyk picked him apart across 5 rounds. Although I think you have to say Joe Joyce was very green at the time. He's obviously improved since then, but Alexander Usyk is a very tricky style matchup for him. I think that one definitely goes to points. And in that case, who's going to win? The better boxer, or a guy who does have the natural advantages in height and reach, but can actually work the jab? Would he be able to actually land on Usyk often enough though? Alexander Povetkin at number 4. Povetkin, he certainly would be looking to get to the inside, very good inside fighter, and he would probably be targeting that body, which Joyce has looked in that Bryant Jennings fight vulnerable to it. I think though at 40 years old, 41, a lot of people would probably favour Joyce though. Even though Povetkin knocked out Dillian Whyte, does Joe Joyce have a considerably better chin, or would that not have mattered with that sort of shot that Povetkin landed on Whyte? If he landed it on Joyce, would that take out his lights? It's a question. Then at number 3, you have Anthony Joshua. Number 1 there, Tyson Fury. I think I would favour Tyson Fury and Anthony Joshua to beat Joe Joyce. Deontay Wilder, hard to say there. He's at number 2. He is a big puncher, but if Joe Joyce is able to bully him the way in which Tyson Fury did, take away that right hand to some extent, but then again, Joe Joyce doesn't necessarily have the same level of skills and head movement that a Tyson Fury does. Could Joyce, eat many of those big right hands if they land flush? Certainly a question. But if he's able to back Deontay Wilder up in the same way that Tyson Fury did, bully him and try to break him down, be an interesting fight. But I think a lot of people would probably favour Wilder in that situation. But I guess good jab, good chin, it's going to take him a long way. And there's some very interesting fights that if any of them are to happen there, I'd be very interested in seeing Joyce in them. And Joyce has always been looking for a shortcut to the top of the division to try and get into some big, meaningful fights. The Daniel Dubois fight was his opportunity to try and climb a little higher. And as a result, he's now rated at number 10 on BoxRec. Some people may say that's a little bit high in the context of the division. Maybe he's inside the top 20 or inside the top 15, but maybe not the top 10. What do you make of it all? Who would you like to see Joe Joyce fight? And who does he beat? Who is actually going to be able to throw something different up to Daniel Dubois and prove to be a much trickier customer when they face Joe Joyce, if they face Joe Joyce? Let me know. Drop a comment, loud and often. Hit like, hit subscribe. Follow me on Twitter, boxing_squared. I'm out.